how are Americans and Canadians different? That is the question we'll be exploring today, and I'm going to show you the history, data, and my own personal experience so that by the end, you'll see these countries in a whole new way. In this section, you'll find out where these differences come from. Here, you'll see how broadcasting rules shape political discourse. And at the very end, you'll see who's actually more polite. Who do you think is more polite?
Oh man, okay. I noticed it pretty quickly coming to Canada.
Canada's a lot more conflict averse and conflict avoidant.
I don't think it's true to the extent of everybody is super kind.
But in order to have that conversation, we first have to set up a few frames. Frame 1, I'm talking about big English-speaking cities. There are a lot of diverse people and regions in these countries. East Coast versus the West Coast versus the South, Anglophone versus Francophone, it's impossibly nuanced. So I'll mainly be comparing what I know, and those are the big English-speaking cities. Of course, New York doesn't represent all of America, and Toronto doesn't represent all of Canada. But on top of that, I'll be generalizing. Everything I'm about to say is a generalization. After all, countries are made up of individuals, and no single comparison will capture every single person's unique lived experience. So we'll mainly just be focusing on the big picture and broader trends. And lastly, I love both countries. I love Canada and I love America. I'm not here to pick sides or declare one as superior than the other, because what does that even mean, y'all? Things are just different, and at the end of the day, it's whatever's best for you. So because we'll be comparing ways of life, it's important here to remember that there is no one singular right way to live. There's just different. And I think it's this diversity that makes the world such a beautiful and interesting place. Now on to our first topic of 6, which are values. America and Canada may share a border, but they were both founded on fundamentally different values. Values that ripple out across everything from governance to daily life. You see, America was founded upon the belief in certain unalienable rights.
And that among these are life,
Liberty.
The pursuit of happiness.
These 3 ideals, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, reflect the American belief in individualism and self-determination. After all, America was born from a revolution, and the goal was to protect individual rights and freedoms at all costs. On the other hand, Canada has a different set of 3 values enshrined in its constitution, and they are
peace, order, and good government.
Peace, order, and good government.
Peace, order, and good government, or POG.
Whoa, okay, this is a huge contrast from the American motto. While LLPH focuses more on individual rights and freedoms, the Canadian motto puts greater emphasis on collective well-being and stability. And historical context explains this too. While the US fought a revolution to gain their independence, Canada achieved theirs gradually through legal reform and diplomacy.
We read in that clause a tradition of moderation, a preference for ordered development rather than revolutionary change, and an acknowledgement that government is for the common good.
Okay, this is nice and philosophical, but how does this actually affect practical matters? Well, I think the biggest examples are social benefits. In the US, social programs are generally more limited and temporary, which reflects the LLPH emphasis on individual self-reliance and minimal government intervention. On the other hand, Canada, with its POG values, offers more comprehensive social programs that emphasize collective well-being. A prime example of this is universal healthcare, which I actually talk about in part 1 of this series on the USA and Canada. If you haven't watched it yet, you should definitely watch it after this video. Now, it's important to note here that these are big, sweeping governance philosophies and don't necessarily reflect every person's values. You'll find plenty of liberty-loving Canadians and plenty of community-focused Americans and everything in between. It's a spectrum. So simply calling one country individualistic and the other collectivist is a bit too much of a generalization, in my opinion. That being said, one difference that is less of a generalization, and you can actually see and feel, is scale. When I first moved from Canada to the US, I was just struck with the sense that everything is bigger. The streets, the cities, the monuments, everything really is bigger in America, including America itself. Here's what I mean. This is the population of Canada. This, on the other hand, is the population of the USA. The US is not just 2 times, 3 times, or 5 times, but 8 times bigger than Canada. Canada's biggest metropolitan area, the Greater Toronto Area, has a population of about 6 million people. On the other hand, the US has 8 metropolitan areas that surpass that, the largest of which is the New York metropolitan area with a population of, get this, over 19 million people. And that's not all. While Canada is the 9th largest economy in the world with a GDP of $2.1 trillion, the USA is the largest economy in the world with the GDP 12 times bigger than Canada's at $25.4 trillion. Simply put, America is bigger, wealthier, and more influential than Canada. And when you have such a huge difference in power, you'll also have an asymmetrical relationship. Pierre Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, once said,
"Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly or even tempered is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt."
I find that many of America's actions have ripple effects up in Canada. So, up there, we pay close attention to American news.
Canadians both care and know more about U.S. politics than they know about Canadian politics. And it's been very shocking to me because I was here actually in 2019. I was going to a coding boot camp, and this was during election season, both for the writing election as well as the US presidential election. The amount of people in my course who knew more about what was happening with the US election or didn't even know that there was the writing election happening at all was I was shocked.
As a result, I find that, in general, Canadians tend to know more about the US than Americans know about Canada. As far as I know, all my American friends know about Canada is that it's cold, we have maple syrup, and free healthcare. But I don't fault them for that. Canada is just a waning middle power. We're not an economic giant, we don't export nearly as much media and pop culture as the US, so why should your average American feel compelled to know about Canada?
It's exactly that. We have to know what's going on down there because it's such a force in the world. They just influence everything in the world. So it's kind of makes sense that they don't have to be aware of what's happening in Canada, because we could do something and it's not really a big deal, but if they do something, it's going to affect our lives drastically, right? Yeah.
But this difference in global influence trickles down into how each country approaches work and wealth. So in part 1 of this series on the USA and Canada, I talked about how America is for the ambitious, and how if you're trying to optimize for career success and economic advancement, then America is a really good place to be. In this video, I'd like to explore this in a bit more depth and specifically focus on how this affects people's lives. American workers work on average nearly 15 workdays more than their Canadian counterparts, except in 2023, which I'm still unsure of what happened here. It just looks like a big anomaly, so I'll just be examining the prior years. According to research from Isgut et al., over 40% of the gap is due to Canadians taking more time off, particularly higher income Canadians who take more vacation time than their American counterparts.
In all 3 of the jobs that I've had in Canada, it's always seen as hey, when you're expected to be here, you need to be here, but also you need to take vacation. You are expected to take it within the year, and only in certain circumstances are you allowed to roll them over to the next year because they want you to take your vacation. It's we're paying you to not be here for a little while so that you can be a better worker for us. Whereas in the States, especially if you work an hourly job, it's always seen as you're the problem if you're not working. It's almost anytime you are not here, you're a burden for us.
And this largely comes down to a difference in labor laws.
Canadian workers are a lot more protected by law than in the US, at least based on what I know, based on the research that I've done.
Anastasia is one half of the YouTube channel Make That Change, which talks about all things Canada.
Another big difference is the federally mandated vacation time. So Canada has a minimum of 2 weeks vacation requirement, and then depending on how long you stay at the company, you're entitled to longer vacation times, and it's something you can negotiate. In the US, as far as I know, there's no minimum vacation requirement, so it's at full discretion of the employer.
As a result, close to 1 in 4 Americans have no paid vacation and no paid holidays. And even for those who have paid vacation, nearly half of them don't take all of it. About half of these workers say they don't feel they need to take more time off or worry they might fall behind at work if they took more time off. Some say that they feel badly about their coworkers taking on additional work, while smaller shares cite concerns that taking more time off might hurt their chances for a promotion, or that they might risk losing their job, or say their manager or supervisor discourages them from taking time off. But beyond just taking time off, America is known to valorize hustle. There's a long-standing cultural narrative that hard work, often to the point of overwork, is key to achieving the American dream. Constant productivity is a virtue, a signal of ambition and dedication. What this means in practice is that employees feel pressure to work through vacations, answer emails at all hours, and always be on.
So Canada is very much 9 to 5. I would say that's also the very first thing I've noticed having entered the workforce in Canada, because I grew up watching US movies and seeing how people kind of work nonstop, kind of 24/7. They are in a dinner with their family and they take on work calls. You know, they work on Saturdays and Sundays and that kind of stuff. You will not see that in Canada, and I think it's mostly frowned upon to have that.
The result of all this isn't just a reluctance to take time off, but a pervasive mindset that equates continuous work with one's moral worth and professional standing. Now I can tell y'all straight up that this isn't a thing in Canada, or at least it's not as widespread. Again, Canada's labor laws guarantee paid time off, and when you combine that with a universal healthcare system and a robust social safety net, both of which aren't tied to your employer, Canadians generally feel less pressure to sacrifice personal time for fear of losing their benefits or falling behind. But this cultural difference in work attitudes also informs how the two countries approach risk. American culture places a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship, innovation, and risk-taking. And it's not just a cultural thing, it's actively supported by the country's financial infrastructure. In 2022, VC investments in the US totaled approximately $209 billion. In contrast, Canada's 2022 VC investments only added up to $8.2 billion. In addition to that, American banks are known for being more lenient and risk-taking compared to their Canadian counterparts, and this plays out in several ways. For starters, Canadian banks are tightly regulated by the u.s.a to maintain stability. American banks, on the other hand, have historically operated in a less restrictive environment, which allows for more aggressive lending practices, think securitized mortgages, which were a major part of the 2008 financial crisis. While no Canadian banks failed during that time, the US saw several significant collapses. Add to this a regulatory environment that's generally more business-friendly, and you have yourself a country where taking entrepreneurial risks isn't just possible, but celebrated. In Canada, the approach is much more fiscally conservative. While there are certainly entrepreneurs and innovators in the country, the culture as a whole still leans towards stability rather than disruption, and this makes sense going back to the entire POG versus LLPH thing.
So when it comes to work culture, I think one of the biggest differences I see is that Canada is a lot more conflict averse and conflict avoidant. It's very much focused on teamwork, collaboration, and making sure that there's like consensus and everybody agrees with what needs to be done. So people don't really like kind of stirring up the pot or creating conflict and stuff like that. And in fact, if you come in and kind of try to maybe stand out or be that disturber, it's not generally appreciated. Whereas I think in the States, it's a little bit different.
And this more conservative work culture also shows up in how Canadians talk about and handle their finances.
A new survey by the real estate firm Royal LePage indicates that 1 in 4 Canadians say they plan to purchase an investment property in the next 5 years.
If entrepreneurship is the go-to in the US, then in Canada, it's real estate. In 2022, approximately 40% of Canadian household wealth was tied up in real estate, in comparison to 31% in the US. And I remember back when I lived in Canada, that was the default path that my peers and I talked about. You'd make your money in a nice, stable job, and then you'd invest your savings in real estate. Rarely, if ever, did we talk about entrepreneurship or more speculative ventures, though not for lack of want, but mainly for lack of possibility. Canada's stock market is less diverse and dynamic than the US's, so I just ended up investing all of my money in American stocks. In addition to that, Canadian banks are more risk-averse, and there's just fewer VC opportunities. Now, this isn't to say that Canada lacks innovation or ambition, not at all. Canadian companies like Shopify, who are not sponsoring this video, unfortunately, are emerging global players. And furthermore, the Toronto-Waterloo corridor is one of the fastest growing tech hubs in North America. So there are plenty of innovative, ambitious entrepreneurs in Canada, and things are changing. Though, to be honest, it's changing slowly, and it does depend a lot on government support. So to conclude, these different approaches to work and wealth ultimately come down to priorities and values. The US thrives on ambition, hustle, and risk-taking, and its culture and economic system reward that. Canada, by contrast, places greater emphasis on stability and security, as demonstrated by its work culture and preference for relatively safer investments like real estate. Again, neither is inherently better, it's just different, and it all depends on what you personally value. However, the cultural differences don't end there. They also extend into how each nation handles disagreement and polarization. America is politically polarized. Yes, I know this is just as shocking to hear as water is wet, the sky is green, wait, what? It's practically a given at this point, and the two-party system with its incentive structures has a lot to do with it. Now, politics is radioactive, and I don't want to end my YouTube career, so let's shift focus. What I really want to highlight is how news media feeds into this polarization, and how it's different in Canada. Now, before I go any further, let me just acknowledge upfront that straight news reporting absolutely exists in America. Shows like NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, and PBS NewsHour deliver fact-based, balanced reporting every day. But here's the thing. In the US, straight news programs like these aren't culturally dominant. They don't set the national conversation in the same way that opinion shows on Fox News, MSNBC, or Newsmax do. And the shows on these networks, they're loud, they're engaging, they're emotional.
Truly sickening. I mean, this is sick.
Just destroying the working class Americans.
That these racist, xenophobic views are...
Or the liberal cult mindset.
Is that what happened? Is that what happened in this case?
Certainly doesn't sound like unity to me.
Which is great for them as a business vying for your attention, but not so great for journalistic neutrality. And people realize this. Americans' trust in media is close to a record low. 28% of US adults say they do not have very much confidence in mass media, and 38% say they have no trust at all.
The national news is more polarized, certainly on broadcast and cable, and it's much less reportage and much more opinion.
In Canada, it's different. Hyperpartisan networks and shows like these don't really exist at scale. The big three Canadian news networks, CBC, CTV, and Global, are mostly defined by straight news reporting. Now, I'm not saying that Canadian news is perfect. Bias definitely exists, and sometimes the way that they handle stories isn't always the most balanced. However, it's not as overtly partisan as what you'd see in the US. To show you what I mean, I'll share a few excerpts from major Canadian news networks, and pay close attention to the wording.
That's either a good thing if you think we already get taxed too much, or it's a bad thing if you ask yourself what the government could have spent that money on.
How they attribute partisan language to its source instead of adopting it themselves.
The Conservatives are set to serve up another non-confidence motion on Thursday, a move the Liberals called lame parliamentary games.
And how they frame things in a way that invites you to form your own opinion.
Parties will be looking at the economy as it affects individual voters, as each tries to prove they offer the best option.
You won't see a national news anchor openly endorsing a political party or aggressively lambasting a politician in the same way you might on US networks like Fox News or MSNBC.
The vibes are horrible, but isn't this what people wanted?
Now, before we move any further, let's just address the obvious critique here. Am I cherry picking? Well, I've been showing you opinion-based shows in the US and comparing them to straight news reports in Canada. So yeah, it's not exactly apples to apples. Canada has its opinion shows too, and America has plenty of neutral broadcasting just like what you'd find in Canada. But here's the key difference: scale. In Canada, if you want overtly partisan commentary, you need to seek it out. It's not driving the national discourse. During Canada's 2019 federal election, a study tracking Canadians' online behavior found that only 1% of Canadians visited Rebel News, a partisan right-wing outlet. The vast majority stuck with mainstream sources like CBC, CTV, and Global, leaving hyper-partisan voices on the fringe rather than at the center of the conversation. By contrast, in the US, hyper-partisan outlets are the mainstream. Networks like Fox News and MSNBC dominate their respective sides, shaping the news Americans see, and more importantly, how they see the world. But why is it like this? Why do we see partisan voices front and center in the US, but on the fringe in Canada? Well, I think it has a lot to do with broadcasting regulations. In the Canadian Broadcasting Act, broadcasters are required to provide a reasonable opportunity for the public to be exposed to the expression of differing views on matters of public concern. America has, or had, a similar regulation called
the Fairness Doctrine.
The Fairness Doctrine.
The Fairness Doctrine was established in 1949 by the FCC, and it required broadcasters to cover controversial issues of public importance in a fair and balanced manner.
The Fairness Doctrine was part of the entrance of the federal government in the regulation of access to the airwaves. You have to have balance. And if there is a presentation of one point of view, you have to have a contrary point of view.
However, critics argued that it limited free speech, led to self-censorship, and was ineffective in achieving its objectives.
The Fairness Doctrine actually diminished the amount of political discourse over the airwaves, and that's a bad thing. They were always very concerned that the FCC might yank their licenses, so they tried to avoid controversial political discussions and instead aired shows about gardening or cooking or something else, which might be very worthwhile, but was not good for political discourse.
And some broadcasters didn't like that they had to present opposing views without stating their own personal side. But isn't that exactly what journalism is supposed to be?
Not only did you have to have the opposing view on, but you could not say which side of it, at least at the stations I worked at, you couldn't say which side of the coin you had a personal commitment to.
That wasn't necessary.
In June 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was about to be codified into federal law. However, Reagan vetoed it. And soon after, the FCC that Reagan appointed abolished the Fairness Doctrine altogether, saying that it unconstitutionally restricted the free speech rights of broadcast journalists.
The Fairness Doctrine, there's nothing fair about it. It is a political restriction of free speech, anti-constitutional, terrible doctrine, and we don't need to see it reintroduced.
A few years later, after the doctrine was abolished, Fox News was founded.
Good morning. Welcome to Fox News Channel.
Now, some suggest that abolishing the Fairness Doctrine led to the founding of Fox News, while others suggest that no, that's false because it only applied to broadcast licenses and not cable TV channels. However, I still think that there's some connection here. According to Steve Rendall in Sisyphus magazine, the true value of the Fairness Doctrine, beyond the occasional remedies it provided, was that it codified the principle that broadcasters have a responsibility to the public to present a range of views on controversial issues.
I don't think that we as broadcasters have the right to go on and express our own views, or the views of an individual party or individual organization, without providing the opportunity for others to have that same right on the air.
So in my opinion, while the Fairness Doctrine certainly wasn't perfect and has its flaws, I don't think completely repealing it was the solution. It's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And so when you combine that with other factors like algorithmic bias, corporate incentives, and the decline of local journalism, it's no wonder why American news media is more polarized and insular. Yet despite the polarization, there is an undeniable strength that both the US and Canada have, and that is diversity. Both countries are incredibly diverse, but in different ways. Let's start with the numbers. In the US, a much larger proportion of the population identifies as Black and Hispanic compared to Canada. From the latest census data that I found aggregated online, the second and third largest racial groups in the US are Hispanic or Latino at 19% of the population, and Black or African American at 11.6% of the population. In contrast, only 2.5% of Canadians identify as Latin, Central, and South American, and 4.46% identify as Black or African Canadian. Now, I should clarify that Latin American and Hispanic aren't directly interchangeable terms as they reflect different cultural and geographic identities, but for the purposes of this comparison, I'm just working with the government's given categories. This is different though for the two largest communities of color in Canada, South Asian and Chinese Canadians, who make up 6.4% and 4.7% of the population, respectively. In the US, they make up 1.9% and 1.6% of the population, according to the US Census Bureau's estimates. Now, this difference is huge when it comes to the cultural influences that shape each country. In America, Black and Hispanic voices are really amplified in American culture. Artists, athletes, and activists from these communities have contributed so much to American culture, history, and language, and not to mention that Spanish is the second most widely spoken and written language in the US. On the other hand, while South Asian and East Asian communities have contributed so much to Canada's social fabric, I still find that from my perspective, Asian Canadian representation is just lacking overall in mainstream Canadian culture, at least compared to our societal impact. Now, some people say that Asians in general don't go for that kind of media and pop culture thing, which, I mean, fair. When I tell my parents I'm a professional creative, all they hear is professional disappointment. But I also think it's a matter of reinforcement. A lot of Asians don't go for those things, therefore you don't see a lot of people going for it, therefore you don't go for it, and it's a cycle that persists, but also illustrates why representation is important. Anyways, to summarize, both countries are diverse in different ways, and this difference in diversity creates differences in mainstream culture. Now on to our final topic, which is politeness. For some reason, everyone loves talking about this one. The Canadians have a reputation for being really, really polite. We always say sorry. We'll give you the oil from our snowmobile. We'll let you take our snowmobile if you need to get to where you need to go.
Really? You just give it to us? Oh, sure, that's what Canadian hospitality is all about. If you like, you can have all my money and my leg. Okay.
Which, actually, now that I think about it, makes more sense given the entire LLPH and POGA thing. But to be completely honest with you, I don't know. I think there are plenty of kind people in both countries, and there's no definitive evidence that I can point to that directly measures politeness levels, because how would you even do that? So while the stereotype is fun to talk about, I think it's more so a difference in cultural communication styles than it is about actual, politeness.
I think that's where, this whole polite stereotype comes from. I don't think it's true to the extent of everybody is super kind, because it's like anywhere else. There's people that are, there's people that aren't. I think a lot of people are, just in general in the world, but I think we express it differently.
In my experience, I've had more polite and respectful interactions with Canadian strangers and more friendly, gregarious, and open interactions with American strangers. Okay, what do I mean by this? First of all, by no intention of my own, I've had more conversations with strangers in America than I have with strangers in Canada. I'm talking about the long chat with the cashier or the person next to you in line. And when I compare the interactions that I've had in Canada versus the ones I've had in America, I found, 1, Americans are usually the ones initiating. 2, they're more open and will talk to you as if you've known each other for years. 3, the interactions were less politically correct and stiff. And 4, you'll learn an American's opinion faster than you would a Canadian's. Of course, this is just my experience and depends a lot on where you are in the country. I've heard it said that this might just be an East Coast versus West Coast thing, or like a urban versus suburban versus rural kind of thing. I don't know, so don't quote me on it. This is what my American friend Samuel has to say.
Okay, last question. Who do you think is more polite?
Oh man, okay. And I noticed it pretty quickly coming to Canada. The stereotype that Canadians are nice. I've said, no, Canadians are not nice people. They're polite people. And I feel like polite, especially in Vancouver, this might not be true Canada-wide, but in Vancouver for sure, it's polite and because I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to interact with you. So I'm just going to be polite. I'm going to let you do your thing. Oh, go ahead. Nice is definitely a misnomer, in my opinion. When I think of nice, I think of a southern mom who's you're oh, come on in, to the stranger or whatever. I've never had strangers in Vancouver be nice to me. I've had them be polite, but I've never had them be nice to me, which is interesting.
At the end of the day, these are just generalizations. And truth is, we're more alike than we are different. There's more that unites us than separates us, and it's these nuances that make the world such an interesting place. And if you want to see some of the lessons that I've learned ever since moving here to the US, then watch this video next.